Today, we become legends.
Tian is described as many things in Chinese mythology. It can mean the concept of heaven, or it can be a true god of heaven with personalized features. The latter interpretation is synonymous with Shangdi, the supreme ruler. After the fall of the Shang dynasty in roughly 256 BCE, the Zhao dynasty rose, and Tiangong assimilated the traits of Shangdi in Chinese culture. Effectively, Tian replaced Shangdi to take a shot at the Shang dynasty on the way out. The Zhao dynasty takes no prisoners and makes their own gods. Maybe that's why they were the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history, one family reigning for 790 years. It is believed that Tiangong/Shangdi was the Jade Emperor, who fashioned humans from clay and left them to harden in the sun. It was unclear in Chinese mythology if Tian was a personalized being or a concept similar to nature or time. In my design, I tried to capture this aspect as Tiangong is personalized as the Jade Emperor, but also fights in a very detached way, dealing no damage directly but only influencing the outcome of a fight through buffs, debuffs, CC, and summons. So before I start, if I could balance gods perfectly, I'd be on the design team at Hi-Rez already. There are likely multiple imbalances in the numbers, but it's mostly the design I want to showcase, and I only added the numbers to make it easier to grasp within the context of Smite and what the kit does. Also, another disclaimer, this video has been in the works since mid-December last year, and I had no idea about the announcement of the Jade Emperor coming for Season 9 when I came up with this concept. I've been working behind the scenes on commissioned artwork and things like that, which you should have seen already to really up the immersion of the video and put a face and icons to the god I want to create. In short, it's a crazy coincidence that I chose the Jade Emperor as my concept right before it was announced for the game. This concept has absolutely nothing to do with how the god will be in the real game. But without further ado, let's jump in with my concept for Tiangong as a no damage guardian in Smite. So first up, Tiangong's basic attack chain is 1x 1x 0.75x speed, with the final hit exploding on contact in a 10 unit radius. More on this in the passive, which we'll cover now. So the Jade Emperor's passive, moulded from clay, makes Tiangong's basic attacks ranged and deal no damage. Instead, he coats gods in clay when basic attacking them, applying Mark of Sand. Mark of Sand is allies with the mark are strengthened by the clay and take 2% less damage per stack. Enemies with the mark are made brittle and take 2% more damage per stack. Mark of the Sand fades away after 5 seconds if not reapplied and has a maximum of 3 stacks. The Jade Emperor desires not petty power. Any power he acquires is converted to max health at a rate of 1 power to 2 health. Tiangong also gains an increased assist range of 30. So Tiangong is incapable of dealing damage himself. He plays primarily around debuffs, buffs, summons, and CC. His basic attacks needed altering for this reason. Mark of Sand is pervasive throughout the entire kit, and other abilities interact with the mark in different ways. The final hit of his attack chain is AoE, same size as Ulla's Bow Stance 3, and will apply Mark to all gods hit. Mark of Sand would have its own large noticeable icon above allies and enemies showing how many marks they have, if any. This would only be visible to Tiangong, not others. Though others can still see the buff/debuff on their standard buff bar above their health. Sand Soldiers are a core mechanic within Tiangong's kit. A Sand Soldier is an ethereal pet that follows the allied god. The first time they damage an enemy god, the Sand Soldier attacks afterwards, dealing damage, slowing the enemy and applying 1 mark of the sand on hit, then crumbling to dust. Sand Soldiers only apply to the first god hit and once per ability. One god can have up to 2 Sand Soldiers at once, 1 to each side of them, and they last 10 seconds before crumbling if not used. If multiple enemies are hit in one instance, the Sand Soldier will target the lowest health enemy. So Sand Soldiers are a mechanic within the Jade Emperor's kit, and he has multiple ways to give allies soldiers. They can't take damage or be destroyed. Think about them more of as a buff to your next ally's attack and not actually a pet. It makes more sense that way, though in the implementation they are a pet. They can provide additional slows for allies and deal damage based on Tiangong's max HP, meaning the more tanky you are, the more your Sand Soldiers will hurt, and as I said earlier, there are multiple ways to apply Sand Soldiers to allies within his kit. And speaking of, let's get into his first ability, which interacts with Sand Soldiers. So ability 1, Jade Armaments. Tiangong blesses allies within 55 units with Jade Armaments, giving them a unique buff based on their class for 5 seconds and a Sand Soldier. On buff expiration, Jade weapons fly from your allies at the nearest enemy god within 55 units of them, crippling them for 2 seconds. This effect also triggers the ally's Sand Soldier to attack. Since Tiangong does no damage and is focused so heavily on buffs and debuffs, Jade Armaments adapts to the god it is applied to and gives a unique buff for their class to make sure it's always useful no matter the target. This also provides extra damage to allies in the form of the Jade weapons attacking, as well as the Sand Soldiers, which will follow up on that damage. So ability 2, Calcify. Tiangong applies Mark of the Sand to all gods within 70 units of him, then commands all marks everywhere to turn to rock and shatter, granting allies 3% increased power per mark for 5 seconds and a Sand Soldier formed from the rubble, while enemies are stunned for 1 second plus 0.2 seconds per Mark of the Sand. This ability removes all Mark of the Sand from its targets. So this ability is Tiangong's primary crowd control. At 3 marks, this stuns enemies for 1.6 seconds and applies 9% increased damage to allies. Since it applies Mark of the Sand itself, you only need to apply 2 marks beforehand to get max value from this, and the minimum effect is a 1.2 second stun and a 3% power buff. As well as the Sand Soldier for your allies, we can't forget about that. As we get further into the kit, you'll realise that Mark is fairly easy to apply, and it's realistic to get 3 marks on this ability consistently, especially on allies, but it does require some setup. The closest comparison to current Smite for this ability will be it's like a Zeus Detonate but CC and buffs instead of damage. You build up Mark of the Sand on targets, then calcify all the marks for big value. Ability 3, Sand Rush. Tien targets a god within 55 units and rushes at them. If it's an enemy, he slams into them, knocking them back and applying Mark of the Sand, then rooting them for 1 second plus 0.2 seconds per mark. If it's an ally, he applies Mark of the Sand, heals himself and the ally for each mark the ally has. If Tien dashes to an ally god, he may dash again up to 3 times total before the ability goes on cooldown, but not to the same god twice in a row. So this is Tien's primary movement ability and provides a bit of healing for him and his allies. There's a trade-off between dashing to an enemy to get the knockback and root as an engage or peel versus dashing to allies for the heal, mark and cooldown refund. Max value for this ability is dashing to an ally twice, then to an enemy with the final one, but it's flexible in its use and can just immediately knock back and root an enemy if needed, or even use all 3 dashes on allies for group healing. This naturally is stronger in 5v5 teamfights than it is in lane, but even in duo lane, Tiangong can dash to his allied ADC, then to the enemy, still getting good value. And finally, to tie the whole kit together, we have Tiangong's ultimate, the Terracotta Army. The Jade Emperor summons an exact clay copy of each allied god except himself with health equal to 15% of his max HP for 10 seconds. They are AI controlled, can use abilities, inherit items and level, and will attack enemies. On death, the Terracotta soldiers crumble to dust, applying Mark of the Sand to all gods within 30 units. This can bypass the 3-stack cap. Terracotta soldiers inherit all Mark of the Sand from their original god that they were summoned from, can be dashed to and healed using Sand Rush, and can have a Sand Soldier applied to them using Calcify or Jade Armaments. If Tiangong dies, the army does not die with him, but waits out the full duration. I really wanted to build an ultimate around the Terracotta army from China, and this was the direction I went with it. Since the Jade Emperor can't deal any damage himself, he can summon the Terracotta army, which can do everything a normal god can do. I set the cooldown of this to 120 seconds since most powerful game-changing ults like this are on longer than the base 90 seconds. The Terracotta army also fixes a problem with no damage designs, and that's that if they're ever on their own, they're actually useless. Be that being caught out of position or playing them in duel, etc. The Terracotta army acts as gods for most purposes, and so Tiangong can apply all his usual buffs, Marks of the Sand, and can dash to them using Sand Rush, as well as give them a Sand Soldier using Calcify or Jade Armaments. He can effectively create his own mini-team for 10 seconds that enables his abilities to still be useful with no allies alive. However, this is an edge case and almost always Tiangong will have at least one teammate to cast buffs on and things like that and can debuff enemies as usual. I was just conscious of him being caught on his own and being literally useless. Aside from duel, this design should probably just be banned from duel since it'll be near impossible to win. Or it can be a challenge for Hatmaster, either way works. The army persists after the Emperor's death as a nod to the actual Terracotta army that has long outlasted the actual Emperor himself. Also, I know I'm taking some creative liberties with regards to the Terracotta army. It was built in the Qin dynasty, the one that replaced the Zhao dynasty that actually popularized Tian. However, the fall of the Zhao dynasty happened barely 11 years before the construction of the army, so I'm at least not centuries off on it. And so with the whole kit explained, let's finish off the video with my general overview and thoughts as well as combos. So a no damage god is something I've wanted in the game for a long time. It's an extremely hard design to pull off since it breaks one of the core mechanics of the game. This is probably why Hi-Rez haven't tried this type of design yet, but I thought I'd try my hand at it. Tiangong has a wide variety of buffs, debuffs, crowd control and summons that allow him to impact the battlefield indirectly, but hopefully with just as much power as a regular god. As you might have noticed, some of these abilities are a bit overtuned compared to similar ones that are already in the game. That's intentional since the lack of damage is a huge downside to playing the Jade Emperor over any other support. This will make him quite a bit harder to pilot most likely than your average Guardian or your average god in general. You can't solo your own green buff, you can't get back camps as a bit of extra farm, you can't clear mid if your mid laner won't be there for it. But I think with careful team play and use of the increased assist range on his passive can allow him to farm as normal. It's rare for supports to clear camps or waves on their own in the first place. I did consider some kind of link mechanic where Tiangong can select an ally similar to Kali passive and gain a portion of their golden XP to compensate this. But ultimately, I don't think it will be necessary. You can keep up as support just by getting assists and using a green starter. Ganesha is pretty much proof of this. His two core mechanics are the Sand Soldiers and Mark of Sand. These two mechanics make a lot of sense once it clicks, but I did find it hard to describe them in a concise way that fits standard ability notation. So here's a more layman's explanation of these two mechanics. Sand Soldiers are like Alquang Dragons, but they trigger on any instance of damage and can have a max of 2 at once. They just charge enemies you attack, dealing extra damage and slowing them, and they're single use. Mark of Sand is applied by all abilities except Jade armaments, though even that gives a Sand Soldier which applies mark on hits. Basic attacks also apply 1 mark and apply an AoE on the final hit. All mark applications can hit either an ally or an enemy, or both. Allies get 2% damage reduction, enemies get 2% damage taken increase based on every mark. Sand Rush roots for longer with more marks, Calcify stuns for longer with more marks, and removes them on hit. The Terracotta Army can bypass the usual cap of 3 marks. The realistic maximum is 7 since the Terracotta Army summons maximum 4 soldiers. Add that to 3 and you have 7. This would make Calcify stun for the base 1 second plus 1.4 seconds for 7 marks, 0.2 per mark. This makes the max stun time for Calcify 2.4 seconds. This, however, is very unlikely to happen in most games since you need to apply 3 marks, then ult and have all the Terracotta soldiers die near that enemy, then use Calcify right after. It's a little bit unrealistic, but that is the maximum potential of the ability. And similarly, the max root time of Sand Rush used on an enemy is also 2.4 seconds. However, without the use of the Terracotta Army, it's 1.6 seconds for both of these at maximum. They have a base duration of 1 second with no marks, but both Calcify and Sand Rush apply mark to the enemy, so really they start at 1.2 seconds each. But that's my design for Tiangong, the Jade Emperor in Smite, a completely no direct damage god design that I tried to make as Smite-like as possible, despite putting the middle finger up to one of the basic mechanics of the game. It would be an impressive feat to get a god like this working in a state of reasonable balance. Most likely this god will release one of the most broken or one of the worst releases of all time, because we've never seen anything like it before. But I think given some time, Tiangong could find a balance point and be a really interesting alternate take on Guardians and supports in Smite. If you enjoyed, don't forget to drop a like before you leave, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.